Today we are moving on to history of literature. Now we will begin the history of literature from an age it is called medieval literature. Okay, so as we go through the slides, we will discuss what medieval literature actually is. Now before that, you might have a question. Why should we know the history of literature? So as you are starting your introduction to literature, you must keep in mind right from the beginning that historical context is very, very important to understand a literary text. There are two reasons for that. Number one, we can understand or analyze a text only when we know which time it was written. So the text written in 17th century will be so different from the text written in 20th century. Additionally, we need to know what time the text, the literary text, is set in. So the time in which a literary text is set in could be different from the time when it is written. So as many of you do watch, various movies and films, you know that there could be a modern movie, maybe made just in last few years, about Greek wars. Okay, so the movie is created in 2010, but it is set in BC, right, before Christ, maybe 400 BC. All right. Now we need to know the historical context in order to fully understand a literary text. So say a text is written about Greek culture today, and we are not aware of the historical context of Greece, we won't be able to fully appreciate and understand the text. For example, there are not many references to mythologies, to gods and goddesses in Greek literature and in the films about Greece. Now, if we do not know how Greece treated gods and what kind of relationship they had with their gods, we will not fully understand why they are naming gods again and again. All right. So in order to analyze a text, or in order to read and understand a literary text, we need to know what time it is written and what time it is set in. Now, it is important to keep the historical context in mind because there are different issues in different stages of history, and literary texts deal with those issues. For example, the literature which was written in 14th and 15th centuries, it was about the tribal wars, the battlefield. But the literature which is written in 20th century these days, it is about technology, the role of technology in human life. So issues are different. These days, nobody would write a piece of literature and set it in present times and talk about the battlefields, right? With sword and, shields and, the iron dress and all that. So in different stages of history, the issues are different. And we can understand the issues described in literary text only if we understand what are the historical issues in that particular time period. So the literature which was written in 18th, 19th century, some of the literature deals a lot with, actually 19th century deals a lot with, world wars, the consequences of world wars, right? The human misery caused by wars. Sometimes people call it war literature. So 19th, 20th century mainly. So depending upon historical context, there are different issues being treated in literature. That is why we need to know the historical context. We also need to know the historical context because depending upon the stage of history, the mode of expression changes. So the mode of expression changes both in the sense that, for example, in Shakespeare in 17th century, the drama was written in poetic form. I mentioned that in previous class too. The drama was written in verse form. But these days, drama is mostly written in prose form. So the people who used to go to theater to watch drama in 17th century Britain, they used to watch drama in verse form and they totally enjoyed it. On the other hand, in the recent times, drama is almost always written in prose form. Now, according to those times, 17th century, the mode of expression was verse form or poetic form because people were so familiar with the verse form and they were more comfortable. Even in their day-to-day communication, they were more comfortable with the verse form rather than the prose form of expression. But these days, all of you probably will agree that majority of the people prefer to talk in prose form, right? As I said that prose, because I used the expression prose fiction, so she was saying that prose is written in paragraphs in sentence form, right? So prose is a plain language. Prose is unpoetic language, right? Without any rhyme, without any meter. So we need to understand the historical context because the mode of expression in various historical ages is different. And finally, we need to be aware of historical context because the language also changes. So the language we speak today in English is almost totally different from the language which was used in 15th century England. Well, if we come across a text which was written in 15th century, we probably will become totally confused and we might claim that this is not English language. However, if we are aware of the historical context of that particular literary text and we know that it was written in 15th century, then immediately we will identify the language to be English, but we will say this is 15th century English. So the scholars and the students and researchers who study 15th century literature, they can easily read that language because they know that what kind of language was written in 15th century England, right? So these are the reasons for us to understand the historical context of literary texts. So when you learn English literature and you take more courses, further courses in English literature, at a later stage, always remember that you should familiarize yourself with the historical context of the literary text that you are reading, even if your professor or instructor is not explicitly demanding that. Okay, so any text you come across, look at the date when it was published. Say it is 1757, it is 18th century. Okay, it is 18th century England, right? So you might like to Google and check what were the issues in 18th century England. What kind of mode of expression was prevalent at that time? What kind of language was used at that time? So if you read the 17th, 18th century novel, the language over there is so rich and so condensed. However, the language which is being used these days in literary texts, that is a little simpler as compared to that language. So after understanding the importance of historical context, let me now just explain to you the starting of English literature. So the English literature began from what we call medieval England, and the years were 450 to 1500. Now the medieval literature or the medieval ages, they are identified to be the dark ages. And the reason for that was that these particular ages, the dark ages, did not have an influence from the ancient Greeks and Romans. So basically, the people in England of 5th century, 6th century, and 7th century, the medieval times, they lived by just some of the local mythologies, and they lived by just some of the Christian ideas of Christianity. But their knowledge was limited just to religion and to some self-made myths. But they were not aware of the knowledge of the great civilizations like Greek and Roman. That is why that age is called the Dark Ages. That was the time when the Roman Empire was also, destroyed, or it collapsed. Now, in this particular age, medieval age, as far as the literature is concerned, it is divided into two parts, old and middle. Now, we are talking about literature of medieval ages. So, the Old English is the earliest writing in English. Okay, and it begins somewhere from the 7th century. However, the Middle English is the second stage, and it begins from 14th century, right? So medieval ages themselves, they range between 5th century to 14th century, and the medieval ages are divided into two literary traditions. One is called the Old English tradition, the other one is called Middle English tradition. The Old English tradition begins from 7th century, while the Middle English begins from 14th century. Now, the most important text from the Old English is called Beowulf. It is the oldest literary work in English, in Old English. And we do not know the author of this particular text. This literary text, in fact, is a poem of about 3,000 lines. And this poem is written in heroic narrative form. What is a heroic narrative form? So by now you know what is narrative. So narrative is something which is written in a story form. But heroic narrative form is a form of the poem in which the achievements of an extraordinary hero are narrated. Okay, so Beowulf, in fact, is a heroic character in the poem who performs extraordinary deeds of bravery. So he kills monsters and things of that kind. Okay. So this is the one of the most initial or one of the first literary texts ever written in English language. It is the oldest text ever written in English language. In other words, it is the oldest text ever written that still exists, right? Now, look at the Old English of Beowulf. Now, starting from here until here, these three lines, they are written in the original English in which the Beowulf was written. The lines are from Beowulf. Students, can you try to read these lines? We probably can recognize the letters. Okay, so it says HWAET probably, and then we can see WEV. We can see this word something like Gardiner, and then in, and then Gerdegum, right? Now, the translation of this line into modern English is like this. Compare these two lines. The line 1 on the top in Old English and the line 1 at the bottom in modern English. So this word HWAET, it stands for so. Okay, and this expression stands for the spear Danes in days gone by. Okay, so Geardagum would mean days gone by. All right, and V stands for the, right? So look at the difference between the Old English and the modern English. That is why it is so important for us to realize and important for us to understand the historical context of any literary text, because it is from the historical context that we can tell that this language is Old English. Now, we cannot read the Old English because we are not expert in that, but there are scholars who are expert in Old English and they can read this text too. So somebody like Seamus Heaney, who has translated the whole Beowulf into modern English. So these lines are from the modern version of the Old English. Now, there are some characteristics of Old English poetry. The first characteristic is that there is a blending of Christian and pagan ideas in Old English poetry. So pagan means something that is not based on belief, something that is not based on religion. Actually, pagan means, ideas based upon idol worship. Okay, so, or pagan could also mean not religious. Okay, so in simple words, we can say that in Old English, we find a blending of religious and non-religious ideas. And there is emphasis on ritual, royal authority, and storytelling. By ritual, we mean the pagan rituals, the rituals of the people who do not believe in religion. For example, they might like to worship fire. Okay, that could be a ritual. They might like to sacrifice a human to gods. That could be a ritual for them. Similarly, there is mention of royal authority in Old English. Why? Because those were the times when royal authority was the only authority available. Okay, there was no modern democracy. There was no, there was no president and there was no prime minister and there was not even the priest authority. right? It was rather the authority of the royal kind of king. And then storytelling, that also is an important feature of Old English. And the reason for that is that in those times, there was a tradition among people to tell stories orally. So the people used to sit together, around fire and tell stories to each other. And because of that habit, they were kind of expert in telling stories. So when these people started writing poetry or writing literature, the art of storytelling was very obvious in their writings, right? So in the Old English, there is blending of Christian and pagan ideas, and there is emphasis on ritual, royal authority, and storytelling. Now we move on to the first great literary figure in the history of England. So the first great literary figure does not belong to Old English, he belongs to Middle English. I told you earlier that Middle English came after Old English, and Middle English started from 14th century. So there was no there is no known writer before Geoffrey Chaucer. So Geoffrey Chaucer is the first known writer in the history of English literature. So approximately he was born in 1343 and died in 1400. And the work that he produced, again, was a big book of poetry. It's called the Canterbury Tales. Now look at the example of the Middle English. These lines are from Canterbury Tales. So if you can see on your screen, you will see that the first line reads like this. Full brighter was the shining of her hue. And the second line goes like this. Then in the tower the noble forged new. Again, you would definitely say that these lines are not totally understandable to you. But probably you will also agree that these lines are a little more familiar to you as compared to the lines we read under Old English from Beowulf, right? So we can see the word brighter, for example, is from the modern English. We have it in modern English as well. Was modern English, the modern English, shining modern English, of modern English. HIR is not in modern English, and HEWE in this way is not in modern English. Okay, but look at the most of the words, they are existing in modern English as well, right? So this is just a demonstration of the fact that as the time passed, the English language continued to change. Now, the characteristics of Middle English literature. In the medieval English, there are medieval narratives which are powerfully moralistic. This is a new feature in Middle English. It did not exist in the Old English. So what do we mean by powerfully moralistic narratives? By that we mean that these narratives emphasized a lot on morality, on the value of truthfulness, on the value of humility, on the value of honesty, features like that. However, in the Old English, as we discussed earlier, there were just emphasis on the ritual, on the common practice which was going on. And the hero in the Old English, the hero figure was the figure who was the most powerful and who could defeat everybody else on the battlefield. So there used to be an extraordinary hero with extraordinary powers, and he could just kill, you know, all the enemies. So that figure was a hero figure in Old English. However, in the medieval English, in the Middle English that we are discussing now, in Middle English literature, there was a strong element of morality. So it was not about power for the power's sake. Rather, it was that the hero characters, the heroic characters in this literature were those who had good morality. So who spoke the truth, who were not, exhibitionist, who were humble. Those were the characters who were portrayed as heroes. And I'm sure you can clearly see the difference between these two kinds of characters. There were also generic qualities, in Middle English. By generic qualities, we mean that the writers were aware of the form of the literature they were producing. Okay, so for example, Geoffrey Chaucer, when he wrote The Miller's Tale, it is a tale in Canterbury Tales. It is part of the Canterbury Tales. He wrote it as a fable. And fable was a genre of verse narrative, okay, where usually, you know, uh, non-human characters are made to act like human. Now, another feature of medieval English, it is common in Old English as well, is this that medieval English, in the Middle English as well as the Old English, the literature written in those times was never mechanically reproduced. And I'm sure you understand why, because there were no printing presses at that time. So all that literature and all the copies which were available in that literature, they were handwritten. And that is a very, very important characteristic of Old and Middle English. You actually might find it surprising that a literature written like 700 years ago or more still survives today, even if there was no printing press at that time. So this is about the medieval English that we discussed today, and we discussed that there are two stages of medieval literature. One is the Old English and the other is the Middle English. Beowulf is the most important poem in Old English, while in Middle English, Geoffrey Chaucer is the most important writer who wrote his famous Canterbury Tales. The Old English had, the blend of Christian and pagan ideas. However, the Middle English was about moralistic characters and moralistic themes. So let me know if you have any questions.